Welcome, Arrowheads, to Episode 2 of GATV LOOSED, the week in Arrow for the week of February 26th to March 4th, 2017. On tap for the show, a review of this week's episode and news of the week, including post-mortem EP and star interviews on the episode's big reveal, ratings, and some looks ahead to Episode 16. I wanted to thank everyone who took a listen to our first episode earlier this week, and welcome you back for a second helping. Also, hi to anyone joining us for the first time. I'm your host, Matt Tucker, editor and senior writer at GreenArrowTV.com. Let's play our game. We start naturally with a recap and review of Season 5, Episode 15, Fighting Fire with Fire. The City Council meets to decide if Mayor Queen should be impeached and potentially removed from office over the cover-up of Green Arrow's coerced murder of Billy Malone. It would be only the second time in Starling Star City's 140-year history that its mayor be impeached. Adrian Chase submits his resignation as district attorney, which Oliver won't accept. He asks Chase to represent him at the hearing with the council. Following damning evidence that points to Oliver asking Chase to squeeze the medical examiner to change her findings in the cause of death report to implicate Prometheus, Oliver, Thea, Quentin, and Dinah travel by limo to begin planning for formal impeachment proceedings. The limo is attacked by Vigilante, who manages to fight off the injured Thea and Dinah's sonic cry before splitting when the cops arrive. The attack postpones the city council's actions. Vigilante and Prometheus tangle on a rooftop, each claiming domain over taking out Oliver. Prometheus manages to throw Vigilante off the roof, but Vigilante disappears. It's then revealed that Prometheus's true identity is Adrian Chase. Oliver gets checked out at the hospital for a potential concussion by Dr. Schwartz, Team Arrow's de facto doctor, who is well aware of Oliver's double life. She suggests he find something or someone to help take his mind off of things so he can heal. Oliver has been trying to repair things with Susan, but she won't hear it. She's taken to reporting news on her own blog. Oliver asks a befuddled and reluctant Felicity to help him with Susan, and she eventually provides evidence to Susan's former bosses that the plagiarism story was faked. Susan gets her job back and tells Oliver she won't tell anyone his secret. Diggle confronts Felicity about her odd behavior of late, and she admits to having gotten a device called Pandora, which has helped in all of their actions lately. He warns her to be careful not to use it as a weapon, and she chides him for knocking on her using dark methods when everyone else on the team has done so. Diggle warns her that fighting fire with fire can get you burned. Meanwhile, Thea tries to employ Felicity to dig up dirt with Pandora on the swing vote council member to get things to go Oliver's way. Oliver finds out and puts an end to it, telling Thea that she is going too far. Oliver decides the best course of action is to use Green Arrow as chum. He holds a press conference and tells the city that Green Arrow went rogue and killed a cop, and that the cover-up was to keep the city from being dispirited that their hero had fallen. He vows to hunt down the Green Arrow. Meanwhile, Curtis has been spending time perfecting his T-spheres, and the team manages to use a fragment of Vigilante's tech visor Dinah found at the attack scene to develop a way to track him. Team Arrow finds Vigilante at a building across from City Hall during Oliver's press conference, set to assassinate him. The T-spheres help to stop Vigilante, but he gets away. Felicity meets up with her Helix contact, Elena, and accepts her offer to join the group. Curtis meets up with Paul, who has the gall to invite his husband to a restaurant for dinner, only to drop divorce papers on him and cut out. The city council votes not to impeach Oliver, meaning the mayor, Chase, Quentin, and Thea get to keep their jobs. Thea quits, though, telling Oliver that he was right about the path she has been going down. She needs to take time to fix her broken self. After Susan leaves City Hall, she's confronted by Chase, who tells her he's got a story to tell that could mean life or death. In the flashbacks, Oliver holds a gun to Gregor's head while he holds a gun to Anatoly's. More Bratva show up, and Anatoly invokes a right of challenge to take Gregor's place as the Pakhan, or boss of their Bratva cell. The cell all meet to decide which side they will be on, with most selecting Gregor's side. Oliver hoods up and breaks into Kovar's mansion to steal evidence that Gregor was paid off by Kovar. He interrupts the challenge to present everyone with the evidence. The cell is aware of the 80 million rubles that Gregor was going to distribute among them, but Oliver points out an additional 40 million rubles that Gregor never mentioned. The cell shifts allegiance to Anatoly's side, but then Gregor's remaining few open fire on their own brethren. Our first major plot element of the episode is obviously Oliver's potential impeachment. Now, I'm not sure how many are familiar sort of with the impeachment process. I think we're probably going to get a little more familiar with it as sort of the national political landscape starts to change. And I'm not going to get too far or too deep into politics here with it. We all have enough of that sort of elsewhere. But I do find it interesting that they bring this up this season, because it does seem to be sort of a very present and topical element to bring to the show, because I think it does kind of speak to where we're at the moment. But anyway, so the impeachment process, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word impeachment, just automatically assume that it means that that someone is being removed from office. Removed from public office for the impeachment actually is a little bit different for that. Impeachment itself is actually a body bringing charges, a governmental body bringing charges against another, and it's typically the legislative branch of the government is bringing some type of a charge, usually against somebody in the executive branch. And in the case of a show like Arrow, where it's dealing with city politics, it's the legislative branch in that case would be the city council, looking to bring charges for potential wrongdoing against a member of the executive branch, who in this case would be Oliver, who would be the head of the executive branch, the mayor for it. So the impeachment is bringing charges and then determining whether or not somebody is guilty or innocent of those charges. And then from there, then they can determine, what actions they want to take for to sort of punish that person for their actions. And usually, depending on what it is, if it's serious enough to get to the impeachment phase, usually it's something that is going to probably remove that person from office. Although the last time, and we kind of usually deal with this on a national scale, and the last time that we had somebody impeached, we had a president impeached, was actually Bill Clinton. And as we know, he was not removed from office. He was impeached. They questioned him regarding certain scandals and things that were going on at the time, and they did not determine that it was worth removing him from office. So impeachment doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be removed, although it is a serious enough process that seems the likely outcome for it. So in this case, what they're dealing with in this episode is actually sort of a preliminary step of impeachment, which is them determining whether or not there is evidence to bring charges against Oliver and whether or not they're going to go through with impeachment. So this is sort of that first phase of things before they even get to an impeachment, before they would ever even deal with potentially kicking him out of office for it. And it's an interesting setup, and I always have to wonder. So we're all probably pretty familiar at this point that Mark Guggenheim, one of the executive producers of the series, is a lawyer. That was his profession before he turned to writing and eventually got into film and television. He, as a lawyer, it's always interesting to me to see when they address some of these aspects from a real world perspective of how close they actually get to that or not. Guggenheim actually just wrote the episode on the gun control and gun violence issue a couple of episodes ago for it to kind of address potentially some of the legal aspects. They kind of skirted the legal, some of the true legal arguments related to that issue a little bit. I thought the resolution of the issue was a little too fantasy. It didn't really have enough gravitas to it to determine if it was a workable solution in a real world situation for it. And some are going to say, hey, it's a show, it's a TV show, it's entertainment. Why do we have to worry about real world, whether it applies to that or not? I think once you delve into these kinds of issues, it's always interesting to see how well somebody approaches something, because it lends it a believability or a credibility, or it also potentially shines light or insight onto something that maybe we aren't as necessarily familiar with. Like I mentioned, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word impeachment, think that means that somebody's being removed from office. And that's not necessarily the case. So it's nice to see sort of a representation of that process. And I think for the most part, the show kind of gets that right. The one thing that I would kind of speak against, I think, with this process is I kind of wish that they had taken their time with it. It feels like something that, one of the things that we always deal with Arrow is, yes, there are serialized elements to the show. There's a continuing narrative that just keeps going on. But very often there are still these episodic storylines where everything is contained to that one 42-minute experience. And in some cases that works. In others, you kind of get the feeling that they are kind of brushing past something far too quickly. And I think that they maybe had an opportunity here with this particular storyline to maybe delve into things a little bit more with it. So it from that standpoint, there's a little bit of a disappointment that it was sort of wrapped up as quickly as it was in the episode. But at the same time, you do have to fall back on that, on whether or not you want to get too close to reality with these kinds of situations. One of my favorite TV shows of all time is The West Wing, which I'm kind of in the process of rewatching at the moment. And they do a pretty good job of, I don't want to say lecturing, but at least kind of giving you a perspective on politics and what we deal with in the world. There's obviously some fantasy element to it. And there are at times when they're dealing with an issue that does stretch a little bit more than one episode, but there are often times when they deal with something that they do address it in a single episode. And it's something that would probably drag on for days, months, weeks, years in the real world, that they're able to kind of come to some conclusions or resolutions or steps forward within an episode for it, just to kind of give you at least a taste of what that is. And I think there are times that Arrow can do that well, but and they did it pretty decently with this episode. You just kind of wish that maybe they had spent a little more time on this, because I think it would have helped kind of really establish what Oliver Queen's relationship is like with the rest of city government. And maybe people don't want to see that, but he is the mayor. They've decided to focus on him being the mayor, so I think maybe they could have benefited from seeing that a little bit more. One of the things I liked about this particular storyline is that they brought back, and rightfully so, they brought back the alderman or the alderwoman who worked with Oliver on the gun control issue. And it makes sense. I mean, she was elected to the position. It wouldn't make sense to recast that or to have whole new faces. Of course you're going to see her there. She's a big part of city government. So it was nice that they kept that continuity. And we'll see kind of... They had a little bit of sort of an adversarial role during the gun control issues. So, and she mentioned, by getting to this agreement that she was going to sort of have a marker for Oliver politically to cash in at some point in the future. And it didn't happen here. So it's interesting to see where that relationship might go. But the bigger thing to come out of it, and we could talk about this a little bit more, I think, in talking about the Prometheus plot. The interesting thing to come out of that is that the resolution of the impeachment storyline or potential is that Oliver has to pit himself against himself, and he has returned his heroic persona back into a vigilante, back into a criminal. And that's going to be, that I think is going to open up a lot of story possibility as we head into the tail part of the season now. And I thought that aspect of it as a resolution for this particular storyline in the episode worked really, really well. The next thing I wanted to talk about, the next plot point, is Thea'S dark path. And it's a little bit of an odd structure to things, because the last episode, in episode 14, we have this, I hesitate to use the word confrontation, but we have this moment where Oliver comes to his sister after he finds out that she was responsible for this action that Felicity took that resulted in Susan Williams getting fired. And he says to her, I understand, you have good intentions, but you're very much like Mom. And we know that Mom was a good person. She had good intentions, but she oftentimes made some very bad decisions, made some very bad choices. And he presents that to her, and Thea kind of takes it in, and she seems to kind of understand what he's talking about. And yet, this next episode, immediately, she's right back to doing it. And it seemed weird structurally that they had that sort of reveal last episode, and then we get this extra little bit before she comes to a decision that, oh yeah, he's right, he knows what he's talking about, I need to change my behavior. Seems a little odd. I mean, it fits story-wise. You're dealing with a situation where they need to protect what they're doing. Oliver's made very clear that he needs to protect his position as mayor against the threat of Prometheus. That if Prometheus takes that office away from them, it would be disastrous for the city and their efforts to help protect the city. Because they need that side of things. They need him to be in a position where he can do things legally, but also allow for them to do the things that they need to do without being blatant about it, but sort of not impeding them from doing their vigilante work. And having somebody who is, pro, as he calls them, auxiliary law enforcement in the mayor's office works hugely to their benefit. If Oliver's kicked out as mayor and that administration is gone, they're going to look at the Green Arrow as a criminal. And so now not only can he not protect what they're doing legally, what they're doing as the heroes could bring the cops against them as well. So it kind of destroys everything that they're working for, which is kind of sort of basically what Prometheus is hoping to do and trying to do. And so it makes sense that Thea, who, has taken on this role as Oliver's chief of staff and is trying everything to protect him as the mayor, would look for opportunities to ensure that this thing comes out in his favor. At the same time, she's kind of got this skewed view of things. She refers to herself as broken. She's got this skewed view of things where this makes sense that the only way to get him out of this jam is to blackmail somebody, right? You've got this council vote, and I don't remember the exact number of council members that they have. I'm assuming that they probably have 9. I know a lot of cities, that's kind of what their government is structured like. Here in Seattle, we have a 9-member city council. I think there are other places where they include the mayor in those decisions as well. Like they have an 8-person council, and then the mayor could be a deciding vote if they needed to. But that's what it is. It's sort of like the Supreme Court of the United States. You have a 9-member, an odd number of people, so that you can have the debate, and then you can have a vote where if it came to a situation where you were sort of deadlocked, 4 against, then you've got that 9th and deciding vote, what's termed the swing vote, because it could swing either way. And so there's a degree of logic behind what Thea'S doing to say, hey, we need to make sure that the swing vote goes our way. And there are ways to do that without being without illegally influencing the situation. There are ways to communicate that to somebody. It's interesting that Thea thinks, well, we've just got to find some dirt on this guy and blackmail him and go from there. So of course Oliver's going to call her on that. He's not going to stand by that. He wants to handle this by the law as much as he can, aside from the fact that, obviously he's covering for himself and being the Green Arrow. He puts the nix in it because he wants to make sure that while they maintain the office, they don't do anything in addition that could potentially lose them that as a result. And what Thea's planning could easily backfire. And so he doesn't see it as an option. And he's absolutely right in that regard. And that aspect of it completely makes sense. It's just sort of the structure between having the meeting between Oliver and Thea last episode, where he tells her he loves her, but he's concerned for her and thinks she's acting a little bit too much like Moira Queen, to then backtrack again this episode before a similar revelation, and her finally deciding, okay, you're right, something isn't working here. I'm feeling, maybe I'm not out there being a vigilante and fighting and attacking things with the bloodlust that I had last season, but there's obviously something wrong and I need to fix it. And it'll be interesting to see where they take that, because it's not really clear where that's going to go, what they're going to do for Thea to sort of find herself again and potentially help to heal herself, and what that's going to mean sort of for the larger storyline. We'll have to see. I'm always hesitant with the Thea storylines. I've mentioned this with Thea and Laurel. They always tended to have this way of giving them something to work with, but then it would last maybe 3 episodes before it would kind of peter out, or they would come to some quick resolution, and then they didn't know what else to do with them. And I have a concern that that's potentially what could happen here as well. So we'll have to see kind of where that unfolds. But that also leads then into another character's dark path, and that's Felicity. And they kind of really address it this episode. They had the episode where they go to Russia, and Rory first confronts her about sort of this new path that she had been taking, because she had reached out to this group Helix and gotten this device, this Pandora device, to be able to break into just about anywhere and find all sorts of information. And Rory tells Oliver about that, and he kind of addresses it at that point. but then he kind of drops it. And it's good that now we're kind of getting back into it. And what I really like is that it's Diggle that's addressing it this time. And it's really great because now we can get a little bit of that original Team Arrow flavor with the two of them. You know, we had a great deal of the episode focusing on Curtis and Renee interacting with each other. So to have Diggle and Felicity playing off of each other for an episode and interacting was really nice to see that. And it was great to see, you know, Diggle put back in that role where he's saying, hey, I understand that we have ways that we have to do things, but you know, be careful with yourself, because if you start to go down a certain path, you might get hurt, you might lose yourself in the process. And I think that's a genuine concern here for it, because even the way that Felicity kind of answers him, and I get it, I get where she's coming from the standpoint of, hey, look at what Oliver's done, look at what you've done, look at what Laurel has done, and Thea and Roy, look at what we've all done when we've had to turn to these dark methods to accomplish this goal that we all have, this common goal. Why should I be any different? And I think Diggle makes a point, which is, it's not you. That's not like you. That's not the role that you've played. And it's not that he's trying to hold her to some different, better, idealized standard. It's him saying, look, I know who you are. We've shared this space and time together for, these number of years. I've gotten to know you, and what I'm saying to you is that I'm, just like Oliver said to Thea, I'm concerned with where you're going. And in a way, I mean, you can't blame him, because Felicity's sort of responses the last few weeks have been sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of sociopathic. She is shut down. One of the tough things that they've dealt with is finding a balance with how to have Felicity deal with the things that have affected her emotionally, and kind of keep her as sort of the lighter end of people in the cave, in the Arrow Cave, to balance out some of the other dark elements. And that was one of the big criticisms that they had with season 3, when she got just as dark, and she seemed to be crying at every turn, and it felt unbalanced. And at times it feels like they try to overcorrect for that, and this has sort of felt a little bit like that. I mean, we had her make the decision last season to turn the missile towards Haven Rock, and we saw how that turned out. And they kind of addressed it a little bit in this season, but for the most part, they really still haven't shown the tremendous long-term lingering effects of what that would do to her. And then we started to see sort of a similar thing with Billy's death. I don't care how logical or rational one person can be. You can't escape the fact that no matter what led to that situation, Oliver is the one who killed Billy. It was him. I mean, it was his actions. And I have to think, just psychologically, that no matter how much you can understand of the situation and move on, there's got to be a part of yourself that sits there and says, I just can't escape the fact that no matter what situation you were put into, ultimately it was your hand that killed this person that I was falling in love with. And it seems weird to me that we've seen so very little of sort of the emotional reaction from Felicity since that happened. She seemed to really forgive Oliver pretty quickly, because she understood the Prometheus situation. And I'm not saying that she shouldn't have, but I'm saying that you logically and sort of consciously, you address things in that way, but there's going to be something that continues to bug you. And we get to see peeks at that this episode, which was nice. And in a sense, like I mentioned, she sort of shut down emotionally and has really turned into, using this Pandora device as sort of her way to cope with it. Head down. Why do I need to address this situation? This is the way that I attack the world that has taken this person from me. I think the tough thing is just we just haven't seen that, and so now they're finally getting to it. And I think that was a good aspect of this episode, and it remains to be seen. Felicity goes and she meets with Elena, her contact with Helix, and she finally agrees to join their group, which, they've asked her to do things sort of in exchange for what they have given her. So it remains to be seen kind of what specifically they're going to get into for it. And looking ahead, it looks like that's going to put them in kind of at a crossroads, and we'll see what sort of the repercussions are for that. But it was nice to have them kind of finally start to really delve into this, and hopefully that's going to play a bit of a bigger or a more prominent role as the rest of the season carries on, because it really did feel like Felicity was kind of shuffled off. I mean, obviously we've had her presence there, and she's brought what she brings to Team Arrow, but at the same time, it has felt that they weren't addressing a fairly big elephant in the room, and now they're starting to, and that was welcome to see, and it was welcome to see that it was Diggle that was helping her to address that. Talk about your odd situations, though. Oliver spending the episode, and I thought it was really interesting that they, so Oliver, they have the attack on the limo, and I'll get into Vigilante in a moment as well, but they have the attack on the limo, and Oliver, the team gets hurt, and Oliver gets, has a head injury, so obviously they're going to worry about, concussion for him. So he gets carted off to the hospital. And I always like when they do these nice little callbacks, and they give you a little information that maybe we didn't necessarily know before, which is this doctor, which was the same doctor that worked on Laurel, is for all intents and purposes is their team doctor now, Dr. Schwartz. She is the one at the hospital who is aware, and I guess we didn't all really realize to the extent, but she knows that Oliver is Green Arrow. And I'm trying to remember when else they introduced her, because maybe I'm confusing them with somebody else at the time, but I know that Oliver's had to reveal that identity before to a doctor, I believe. So here's this doctor who's aware that Oliver Queen, the mayor, is also a Green Arrow, and they turn to her to help them. And I just like that they have sort of this hidden person in everyday life that's kind of helping them out. That's a nice little touch. But I also like the fact that she takes the time to say, hey, look, I'm aware of what you do, and I'm very proud. She basically, the whole reason she wants to help them is she agrees with their mission. But she knows her profession, and she says to him, hey, look, I understand that you have dealt with physically. I mean, obviously you've gone through a lot in your lifetime. Your body's a roadmap of that. But you have to understand that there is a psychological aspect to this, and you need to take time. It's not just physical time to heal. You've got to get mentally right with yourself. And of course, they had the funny line, are you prescribing me a girlfriend? And it is kind of maybe a little bit of a ham-fisted segue into sort of what Oliver's dealing with as sort of a B storyline or a C storyline in the episode. But I thought that it worked pretty well. And it ties us back into the Oliver and Susan situation. And again, I mentioned this before last episode. I'm a fan. I wouldn't say that they've necessarily gone out of their way to make this the most glowing romantic relationship that either the show's ever had or of one that's on television, but I like the chemistry between Stephen Amell and Carly Pope, and I like the chemistry between Oliver and Susan. And I like that he has enough care that he really does want to pursue this relationship. It's not just a distraction. It's not just him trying to hold on to some glimmer of a normal life outside of things. It's genuine interest, and he wants to have this as part of his life. And so his attempts to contact her felt very genuine. I liked that although they could have had, I don't want to say fun necessarily, but they could have had at least story potential in stringing out sort of the adversarial relationship between the two of them. Because he's at this point, basically admitted, because she knows, I mean, she's got the evidence, he's all but basically admitted that it's true, he is the Green Arrow. And they don't really have any pretense to him not being in the conversations that they have throughout the episode. I like the fact that he was working hard to get her back to the position that she was at, because he knows that it's because of him that she lost her job, she lost her profession, something that means a great deal to her. Obviously means a great deal because she's willing to just blog about things. And that's not a knock on blogging. That's just she feels that she has to write and cover the news so much that if she isn't given a professional outlet, she's going to do it herself. And he recognizes that, and he knows how much and how important this is to her. So that sets up this really awkward and kind of great scene between Oliver and Felicity, where he asks her, "Hey, you screwed my girlfriend over. I need you to help my girlfriend." And of course Felicity's like, this is awkward. Why would you're asking me to help you get back together with your girlfriend? That just seems kind of odd. And of course he's like, well, yeah, but of course you're the one that caused these things to happen to her, so there's kind of a responsibility there. And of course she says, all right, fine, she recognizes that about herself. She's not a cruel person in that regard. She knows, yes, this was my fault, so let me help clean up my mess. But it was kind of a funny and interesting interaction between the two of them. And I like the fact that they addressed it quickly to that degree. Like I say, I think if they had an opportunity to stretch out the relationship, or that strained relationship, that adversarial relationship, it would have been potentially fun to see where that went. But at the same time, once she gets her job back and she says to him, don't worry, your secret's safe with me. I really liked that note. What's going to be interesting is to see what her initial motivation was from the get-go. Was she trying to find out about Oliver and his past in Russia and him being a Green Arrow just because she's a reporter and that's her job? Or is there something more to it? Is there something a little more nefarious? Obviously, as best as we can tell, we know that she's not connected to Prometheus because Chase shows up at the end to speak to her. So is this just a professional motivation? And if so, it would seem that she now has gotten to a position where she can sort of let that go. Or is there something else that's going to kind of come back to bite them as the season goes on? That I'm looking forward to finding out. Okay, and so before I get into sort of the big chunk with Prometheus, I just kind of wanted to touch real quick on Curtis and his T-spheres and how many times we can cram a ball joke into an episode. Apparently a lot seems to be the case. I found it interesting that this season they have been able to use the word, it's gotten past the censors to be able to use the word dick. And they seem to have used it on a number more occasions. And now we're covering balls. So, so Green Arrow is going a bit blue. Yeah, okay, we get it. It was funny. Balls, ha ha ha. it was nice. I mean, I think I mentioned it even just last episode that it would be nice to see Curtis get his T-spheres into the mix, and here we are. And it was a great introduction, or not even an introduction because we had seen them before, but it was great to see them in this particular use. I think it gives him that extra edge and ability. It gives him a reason for having them, right? Because we've seen Curtis out in the field, and yeah, he's an athlete. You know, he trained for the Olympics, but he's not the best fighter in the world, and he's frequently getting kind of roughed up when he's out there, which is, you know, why they were kind of suggesting that maybe he just hang back and do the technical stuff. But here he is. He's upgraded his costume, and now he's got his T-spheres, so he's getting closer and closer to the Mr. Terrific that we know from the comics. And so it was nice to see the T-spheres in action and to see how useful they could be. It wasn't just a gimmick, you know, the fact that they used them to be able to track down Vigilante in a reasonable fashion within the fantasy, in a logical fashion, and then he could use them as offensive weapons, was great. And I love, you know, making the distinction between the two. He's got an offensive sphere and he's got a defensive sphere, and I think that they use them well. And then the other part of the episode, which is, you know, Paul finally contacts Curtis, and you knew it was coming. You knew that it was going to be. It wasn't a surprise to see things end up the way that they ended up. It just that seemed to be the way that they'd kind of written Paul from the get-go. But you know, how much of a, to use their parlance, how much of a dick is Paul that he invites Curtis out, kind of setting this expectation, and maybe part of that's just Curtis being himself, setting this expectation that he was, potentially reconciling and not really kind of giving him a clue of exactly what was going on, then invites him out to a restaurant, right? Like they're going to have dinner and talk about things and potentially reconcile, only to drop the divorce papers on him. I thought it was a particularly nasty way to approach it. And Curtis is better off. Screw you, Paul. That's a total dick move. I don't care for the fact that the restaurant was obviously a very barely redressed Jitters from the Flash. Hey, you know, the Flash gets to use the missile launcher, or reuse the missile launcher from season 1 of Arrow for its last episode for the Gorilla City attack. Then, you know, Arrow gets to borrow the Jitters set to have a restaurant. Although I was really kind of shocked at how little they did to redress. I mean, it just looked like Jitters. It didn't look that distinctly different as a restaurant. Anyway, Paul, you're a jerk. Curtis is better off. What an absolutely dick move. What would have been worse is if they had ordered dinner and then he dropped the papers and then he cut out and left a check on him. At least he didn't do that. Whatever. Let's move on to the major plot of the episode, which was Vigilante, but also the reveal with Prometheus. So one of the things, you know, when they announced that they were bringing in the character of Adrian Chase, Adrian Chase in the comics is Vigilante. So it only made sense, although they didn't necessarily have to bring Vigilante into the show. They could have just used Adrian Chase. But it only makes sense when they had Vigilante that you would assume, or that one would assume, that Adrian Chase and Vigilante were one and the same. And it was always very odd that they never got too explicit with that throughout the season up to this point. That they were holding back revealing that. And, for some of us, the assumption was just, they were just looking for the right time to reveal that Adrian was Vigilante. But then at the same time, it started to get a little weird because, yes, there was this offer from Vigilante to work with Green Arrow, and Green Arrow turned him down. So that sort of set off some animosity. But now Vigilante's gunning to kill the mayor. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, Adrian Chase, yeah, okay, we know that Oliver's been in situations where people have gotten close to him before and turned out to be enemies. You could kind of see the potential for them to do that. Now, I remember, and I went back through some notes that I had taken for some reviews that I was potentially working on, or at least from the episodes as I was watching them. And I was trying to think back also to before the season started. After he'd been cast, I'd forgotten the fact that this was going to be a regular part, that Adrian Chase was going to be a regular character on the show. So they bring him in, and my initial thought was, oh, because I'd actually, and even when the season had started, because I think it was 2 or 3 episodes before we saw the character show up onto the show, and then of course it was another 2 or 3 episodes before Vigilante as a character showed up. I had forgotten when Adrian Chase showed up that he was Vigilante. And I want to say my initial thought was, wait a second, are we doing this? Are we doing a Sebastian Blood where this is the guy? This is Prometheus? This is, that seems a little too obvious. We've been there before, and that seems a little too obvious. Plus, they kind of threw in that thing where... I can't remember if it was that I don't think it was they went to high school together, but they went maybe to college together. And Oliver supposedly tried to pick up on Adrian's girlfriend, and he remembered that. And I kept thinking, oh, these feel like familiar beats. And then, of course, that just kind of disappeared, and then Vigilante showed up on the scene, and so the assumption just felt like it was Adrian Chase's Vigilante, and that there was going to be this weird dynamic with Vigilante wanting to take out the mayor, and this Oliver Queen Green Arrow relationship then with that. But lo and behold, they throw us the old Arrow curveball. We're going to always do things a little bit differently, and well, I take that back. So there was a thought that they were going to throw a curve with who Prometheus is, in the sense of, they're kind of leading us down this path to him being this illegitimate son of Claiborne, but then reveal it to be somebody else. And in a sense, they kind of do that, but at the same time, I guess the assumption is that they're kind of maybe leaning towards Adrian Chase being the illegitimate son of Claiborne, and Adrian has potentially changed his name so that he could kind of hide the complete path of that from everybody. I would say that with the reveal, it wasn't like a super shock, particularly because we've seen different kinds of reveals along this line along the way. What I really liked about it, and we'll talk a little bit in a moment about when we cover the news, when we talk about the interview with exec producer Wendy Mericle, she kind of talks about this too. I love where they introduced it in the season. They had an opportunity, and probably in the past where they probably would have introduced something like this. It either would have happened in episode 9, which has been the mid-season finale episode each season, or they would have waited until, the last 3 episodes or maybe the last 5 episodes to have a reveal like this. Just, going back and looking at the seasons and seeing kind of where they usually tend to do these things. So from that standpoint, I thought that this was fantastic where they placed it in the season, and particularly like we talked about last week or last episode, where they haven't been focusing on Prometheus as much as far as him being on screen, but you're always aware of his presence lately, and I thought that they were handling that very well. And so now to actually have the reveal, I think was a tremendously well done job. And then also to have the reveal be in the place that it is in the episode itself, right? This is one of those kinds of things where you would expect it at the end of an episode, that kind of final sting, like, oh my God, they revealed who it is. And yet, no, they reveal it, at the end of like the second act, I think, in this episode after the tangle on the top of the roof. And what's funny to me about that tangle on the top of the roof between Prometheus and Vigilante is it's Adrian Chase against Vigilante, who we were all assuming Adrian Chase was Vigilante, and this is how they come out with the reveal. And that I thought was a pretty smart choice. So now we get to spend sort of the bulk of the rest of the episode with this knowing and this understanding that Adrian, who's sitting there working with Oliver and trying to be super helpful with everybody, is in fact the big bad. Like I say, I mean, it's not surprising because it's kind of sort of a staple of the show. And it sort of fits, these are people that, I mean, you can look at these. Sebastian Blood got close to Oliver. The fact that the Dark Archer was revealed to be Oliver's best friend's father. This reveal of Slade Wilson and his plan coming back from the past. The reveal of Quentin Lance working with Damien Dark. You kind of get used to it's like I say, it's a staple of Arrow that people that are close to Oliver, there are people that betray them and that they usually are part of the larger scheme. So that's not too surprising. I wouldn't say that even the identity is necessarily super surprising. It's just going to be interesting. And again, I think this is great with why they do it right now, because I think it's very intentional. It's very intentional, them saying, well, this seemed like it could potentially be obvious. Let's just address it and let's get into the meat of what's going on. And so from that standpoint, not surprised necessarily by who it is, although I wouldn't say that I necessarily pinned Prometheus being Adrian Chase. But at the same time, I think it's very smart and well done decision because of where Adrian's positioned himself, as well as revealing it now, because now we get to see sort of the perspective of the bad guy, which always, I think, makes for a stronger villain. Yeah, it's great to have a guy who's just evil and you get to fight the evil, but to get to see the bad guy where we get to spend time and sort of get his point of view and maybe sympathize, maybe empathize. Usually it's just a matter of coming to some understanding whether or not we actually agree or feel for their point of view and their position on the world. I think it just makes for a stronger story to tell it that way. And so I commend them for having done that now, because now we've got 16 to 23, 8 episodes left on the season, and that's plenty enough time to really kind of give us a great motivation for Prometheus from Adrian Chase's side of things. And we see that his plan continues to come to fruition. It's in that regard, it's very much like what happened with Slade Wilson in season 2, and I think that's been one of the best things for the show, and it's why it sort of contributed to that feel of a return to form, is because they've approached it in that fashion, where you really get this feeling that Prometheus is steps ahead of Oliver at pretty much every turn. And that's not to say, you kind of get this impression that when Oliver decides to reveal that Green Arrow was a cop killer and turn the city against Green Arrow, you kind of get this impression that maybe Adrian didn't necessarily expect that, but it is falling into line, because where else was Oliver going to go? He had two options, realistically. He could either admit that he was Green Arrow and plead a case for why he was innocent, which would have created its own set of problems. And like Oliver said, they needed to, because at that point he probably would have been impeached and removed from office. if he had admitted he was Green Arrow, not just for the fact that Billy Malone had died, but for the fact that he is this vigilante who is acting outside of the law for all intents and purposes. So he needs to maintain that office. Or the other option is that he gets rid of one or the other of them. And so essentially what he does, and he's not giving up being Green Arrow, but he feeds him to the cops, in a sense. He admits publicly that Green Arrow went rogue, killed a cop, and that the cover-up was merely a way to protect the city from the truth that this hero that they believe in has now turned against them in this fashion. And so so those were the two options that he had, and the only one that makes sense with what he needs to accomplish is to turn Green Arrow over. And not turn him over to the cops, but basically get rid of the protection that he had and the aura that he had, because now the city is going to see him potentially as a bad guy. And it's hard to see whether or not that's going to affect how he protects the city going forward. Obviously, it's going to have some effect, and obviously there's this aspect of it and this sense of it that the reason they're doing it is it does kind of pull Oliver back to season 1 in that regard, where, as the Hood, he was taking down evil, vile people, but he was a bad guy from their perspective, especially the fact that he was just killing these people. And no matter what their transgressions were, vigilantes are not judge, jury, and executioner. The thought process being that Green Arrow should help to catch these criminals and then turn them over to the legal system to take care of what they needed to take care of. Now, obviously, there have been points where, they did all this great work and then it was all reversed. And, obviously there are drawbacks to sort of to their approach. But, Oliver has become very clear, and it's sort of part of the progression and the evolution of the character, that, killing is a potential option, but the method should be, and particularly in his relationship to the city, should be to look for different ways. And so now, sort of like I say, sort of dead pat to Prometheus's plan, they have pulled Oliver back to that relationship with the city of him being seen as a negative, even though what he's doing could potentially be, and likely will be, good for the city. He he is, for all intents and purposes, to use the phrase again, he is a criminal. And so it's going to be interesting to see the way that they play that dynamic, because I think that sets up something very huge for the remainder of the season, heading into, obviously, like we do those last 2 or 3 episodes where they do that run of a finale. It's going to be interesting to see how they set up this Mayor Oliver Queen versus Green Arrow antagonistic relationship, because publicly he's going to have to denounce everything that Green Arrow does, and he's going to have to try every effort to employ the SCPD and the anti-crime unit to try to take down the vigilantes. I'm welcoming it because I think it makes sense for the story. It makes sense for the context of what they're telling. I think it really works. I think the one thing that's a little bit of a drawback about it is just that we've seen it before. We saw it in season 3 with Ra's al Ghul and the League, in the fact that they tried to turn the Arrow at that point into something bad for the city. And so the cops obviously went after him, and Quentin went after him. And that was the whole reason for Roy's sacrifice, was to clear Oliver's name and to clear the Arrow and the Team Arrow so that they could do their job without that specter of being seen as criminals on top of it. And that's why Oliver was able to create the Green Arrow identity, even though, anybody who was really paying attention could see that these are the same guy. He was able to create that identity and say, yes, I was inspired by what the Arrow is doing, but I am doing this in a positive fashion. So that'll be fun to see the way that they play Mayor Queen off of Green Arrow. They did it in the comics. They had repercussions in the comics. It'll be interesting to see how they kind of turn their way into that going forward. And I think that does seem like a very kind of compelling season, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. I think we're definitely going to hear these words in these terms, and particularly once we start to talk about season 6 and probably after the season is over. They've mentioned it before, but for this point, this milestone that we're coming up on, this is going to be how they sort of close this chapter, this opening of the Green Arrow story. This is how they're going to close it off. And it really is sort of a culmination. So there's this potential to be sort of a different show going forward. And this is a way to sort of put that final cap on the origin story of Green Arrow. And so it makes sense to kind of pull him back to sort of where he began and use that as the catalyst for where he could potentially go. They've tried it at various points, or they've tried aspects of it at various points throughout the 5 years, which kind of undercuts the effectiveness a little bit. But for the most part, it seems like they've broken this story pretty well, and they're holding to it pretty well, which is, like I say, it's instantly better than how they were telling the story both in season 3 and in season 4. So that's tremendous. And now we've got an antagonist that we can actually see and spend time with to really get a good feel for what his side of the story is, in addition to Oliver's side of the story, plus this relationship now of Green Arrow being persona non grata in the city, and Oliver having to navigate that while trying to protect the city. Good setup. And I like the fact that we are where we're at with it story-wise, episode 15, and where we are in the season, and it bodes well for the next 8 episodes that we have as we run down to the finale. So there you go. That is episode 15, Fighting Fire with Fire. Interesting fun fact about the episode, the director, Michael Schultz, he's directed some previous Arrow episodes as well. Didn't realize that he's also the director of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band movie from the 70s. They had like Peter Frampton, and I think the Bee Gees were in it. That, if I recall, didn't have the Beatles in it. It's been forever since I've seen that movie, and it's not particularly good. He also directed the 80s classic Barry Gordy's The Last Dragon. If you have not seen The Last Dragon, I'm not going to vouch that you're going to like it necessarily. I love the hell out of it. It's a classic for us that grew up in the 80s. Check it out. I just find it interesting that it's the same director for it. It's fun to see those kind of little fun facts come up with it. Anyway, let's move on to other news. And again, this is for the week of February 26th through March 4th, 2017. We'll start with sort of the one that is probably going to jump out to us. Well, I'll get into, in a moment, we'll get into the EP interview and the star interview for it. But let's talk real quick about ratings. Last week we had the series low ratings for Arrow with it, and taking a look at sort of the trend of ratings this season. The show's, I mean, obviously it's at its lowest ratings that it's had, and that tends to happen with shows that are on the air for longer, and also seems to be kind of a trend for, I think, shows of this kind of genre, and this kind of thematic work. I think, it's one of those things where you're going to get sort of that flame burning really bright early on, and it's not to take anything away from the quality of the show. It's just audience erosion is sort of a real big factor, particularly in shows like this where as they get a little bit longer in the tooth, people just kind of find that maybe they're not as invested any longer, or that they are, that they can catch things at another time, whatever it is. But in any case, so we get to last week and last week's episode where they hit the series low, and the great thing is that they uptick this week. It's not by much. The overnights, which turned out to be the same for the finals, are 1.6 million viewers, and a 0.6 in the demo, the 18 to 49 demo, which isn't bad. It's not horrible. I mean, by other broadcast network standards, obviously that's not particularly great. By the CW standards, that holds true for most of the shows that are on there. I think you have some of those exceptions, like Supergirl, like The Flash, and for Arrow, obviously, the previous seasons they had higher ratings, but this seems to be kind of par for the course for season 5 when you go and take a look at the ratings. The only one that really kind of spiked up above that was the crossover episode, and it had just about double the viewership that most of the season has had so far. I went and took a look at the DVR ratings just to kind of see where they stand for it, and Arrow was at one point one of those shows that was really kind of near the top as far as what they were seeing in people viewing by the DVR afterwards, and sort of the growth of viewership and the growth in the demo as a result of that. And the demo didn't grow too much. So the last data that was available that I saw was for the week of, I think, February 13th through 19th. So this would have been the week of the episode, the gun control episode, Spectre of the Gun, episode 13. Yeah, season 5, episode 13, Spectre of the Gun. So the demo didn't grow in the DVR numbers. The viewership grew by about 54%, which is a bit low-ish for what Arrow's traditionally done in the DVR numbers. So I'll be interested to see, and it'll probably be towards the end of next week sometime when we get to see the numbers for last week's episode, the episode 14. To kind of see how that was truly affected, just see if maybe for some reason people just didn't watch the show when it was there, but then caught it up on DVR afterwards with it. In any case, uptick, and we're kind of in that weird hiatus, that spring hiatus moment where the ratings kind of fluctuate because people aren't sure when the show is actually on before we get into that run up to the finale. So we'll see how that works out. Okay. And for our next bit of news, there was an interview with executive producer Wendy Mericle, and also with star Josh Segarra, who plays Adrian Chase, that was posted on Wednesday night after the episode aired. They had had a chance. Our own Craig Byrne got to sit in on a press call with the interviews to kind of ask questions and talk about the episode and the reveal that was coming up for it. So you can read the full interview or the pieces from the interview. There's an article up on GreenArrowTV.com that you can go ahead and read through and take a look at what they've talked about. But the few interesting points that kind of jump out to me about what Wendy was saying is that they knew right from the get-go that they wanted to use this surprise, this twist of taking the character of Adrian Chase and making him the big bad, as opposed to discovering that along the way as they went through the season, and introducing also the character of Vigilante so that they could essentially mess with the audience in that regard, that they could play around with the expectation, that they've got this character of Adrian Chase. People know that that's the character of Vigilante in the comics. They introduce the character of Vigilante. Obviously, they make that association, but that's not what's going on. And she talks about how they like to take some of the comic book mythology and turn it on its head, twist it around to see if they can tell different and surprising stories out of that. And it's a great little piece of information. And she also talks about, like I was mentioning and talking about, where they looked to place the reveal in the season, and they wanted to play around with that particular structure. They didn't want it to be in the mid-season finale like they've traditionally done in the past. They didn't want it to be a holdout until towards the very end of the season to have that reveal and play out in the last 2 or 3 episodes. They wanted to give it some time so that they could let it breathe and have a really strong impact and tell it from there, which is really great. But now the interesting thing, one of the things that kind of jumps out to me, and we'll talk about it in a moment, because they had a preview for the next episode coming up, episode 16, an episode called Checkmate, where in the preview, it seemed like next episode they're already basically letting in everyone on the secret, letting Oliver in on the secret that Adrian Chase is Prometheus. And yet in this article, Wendy talks about the fact that this isn't something that they're going to be finding out immediately. So there's that wonderful little thing we run into with the marketing team. I don't know if it's done from the production's end or from the CW's end. I believe it's from the CW's end, where they kind of confuse us to actually what's going on with an episode in the marketing. And it does not appear, or maybe it is, but at least from her interview, it doesn't appear that Team Arrow is going to be finding out, or even Oliver, are going to be finding out that Adrian is Prometheus. And that's going to be interesting given sort of the setup of the next episode with him essentially taking Susan captive. So she mentions that, one of the things that they really enjoyed was that they get to live with the reveal of Adrian as Prometheus and play around with that for a while and get to interact with the different characters, with us as the audience in on the secret that they're interacting with this guy who is working against them, and to see how that plays out. And like I say, that is one of the more intriguing things to me to come out of this particular storyline, and particularly where they placed it. But then it's also going to be interesting to see. I don't know if we necessarily expect to see any flashbacks for Adrian's story to get us to where we're at. It's possible, but it's going to be interesting to see a way that we can get into sort of the mindset that brings him to where he's at, because I guess the assumption is that he lost someone, and I'm trying to remember myself. So he lost someone, and there's also this potential that that ties into the Claiborne thing, where this brought Oliver onto his radar, And now he has spent the last 5 years learning everything he can and piecing all of these things together so that he could create this persona that was obviously influenced on the Hood and what Oliver was when he first came back to Starling City. And the events that Oliver's gone through since then to really kind of stick it to him. So it'll be interesting to see where that turns out. But then the great thing is there's also an interview with Josh Segarra, who plays Adrian Chase, and he talks about the fact that, you know, they came to see him in New York to offer him to do this role, and then he didn't find out specifically he was Adrian Chase until after he had taken on the role. And once they revealed who the character was, he went and he got comics and he started digging into the lore of Vigilante and becoming an expert that he could on that. And he went to them and he's like, oh yeah, you know, they're like, hey man, are you ready to work? And he's like, yeah, I'm completely into it and I'm ready to go. And I've been finding all about Adrian Chase and Vigilante and we're good to go. And they're like, wait, what are you talking about? And they revealed to him fairly early on that no. You're not playing Vigilante. You're playing Adrian Chase, but we're doing something different with Adrian Chase. You're the bad guy. You're the bad guy. You're the big bad guy. And we're going to play with the expectations. And so all this research that he did basically is tossed out the window. And it's a great little discussion with that. And he talks about himself as an actor and sort of the fun of getting to play this part. And it's a really good part of the interview as well. Like I say, that's up on GreenArrowTV.com. Feel free to check that out. It's a good read. It's a bit of a slow news week. So our last bits of news are the previews for the next episode. Episode 16, Checkmate. The official description of the episode is Oliver seeks the truth. Oliver gets closer to the truth about Prometheus. Meanwhile, Helix refuses to continue helping Felicity until she does a favor for them. So just so you guys are aware, the episode 16 is not airing next week on the 8th. It actually will be the following week on March 15th. Like I say, this is that point in the springtime where they have to start divvying up some reruns so that they can stretch the rest of the season out to fit until the season finale in May. So it gets a little confusing at this time. We might have a week off. We might have 2 weeks off here coming up after a week back or after 2 weeks back as well. So just kind of be aware of that. But so week after next is when Arrow is back with the episode Checkmate. And the preview is kind of interesting if, like I mentioned, it's potentially misleading. So we get an episode that opens, or we get the preview opens with Talia seeming to talk about Prometheus and Adrian Chase, which suggests that Talia is back in the present at some point. So where has Talia been? And why, when everything was going on with the League and control of the League in season 3 and even in season 4 with everything between Malcolm Merlyn and Nyssa, where was Talia? Is she believed to have been dead? Is she just coming back now? Does that suggest that we're going to see something in the flashbacks of the next episode that would suggest that she's dead and now she's back? It brings up a lot of questions, but it also brings up more questions about how is she familiar with Adrian Chase? And if they're not going to be revealing to Oliver and to Team Arrow this information that Adrian Chase is Prometheus immediately, why are we getting this preview that seems to suggest that? And it seems to suggest that it's Talia who gives that information to, we're assuming, Oliver. A lot of odd things going on in this preview video, this preview trailer for the episode. It seems to maybe be cobbled from a few different episodes, and maybe not the next episode, although it does seem to deal with the fact that it looks like Adrian is going to be kidnapping Susan, and now Oliver's going to have to work to get her back. I don't know. It's hard to kind of make sense of what all that means given sort of their interviews and their responses. Sometimes with the episodes, when you get that next trailer, you kind of have a feel for maybe what's going on going forward. Sometimes they do confuse us. Sometimes they intentionally confuse us with those. This one's kind of hard to kind of guess if this is being intentional, if potentially this stuff is included in the episode as well. And if so, then apparently they might be revealing the Adrian Chase stuff earlier than they seem, than Wendy at least seemed to suggest. But in any case, we will find out in the week after next how that plays out. There's also some, if you go to GreenArrowTV.com, there are some preview images released. There's only about 7 images, and most of them feature Felicity and Elena, her Helix contact. Both super cuties with their glasses. That's fun, but there's not much else to give context to the story and what specifically they're focusing on with it for the episode. I would bet that we will probably receive some additional photos from the episode maybe next week in the run-up. Maybe they're just parsing it out because of the hiatus gap, and maybe we'll get some more news and information on that next week. But for next week, the show isn't off the air. They're actually doing a rerun of episode 11, Second Chances, which is the episode that introduces Talia as Oliver's mentor and trainer in the past, and also introduces Dinah Drake as Tina Bolin in the present. So if you didn't catch that episode, you have a chance to catch up, want to see it again, there you go. We're not going to do an episode review of it next week, but hopefully there's some news that we can kind of latch on to, or maybe we can delve a little bit further into Prometheus, or we might potentially cover a few other things as well, sort of some different thoughts, maybe on characters, different aspects of the series, or this particular season going forward. So we'll take a look and see what we can do on next week's show. But until that time, thanks guys for listening. Again, if you want to take a look at any of the articles that we're talking about on GreenArrowTV.com, if you're on the YouTube channel, go ahead and look in the description below and you'll see links to those various articles for it. Go ahead and give us a like, and you can also comment down below. We're more than happy to respond. Got some responses last week. Also some suggestions on things that we could do to kind of change things up or improve things. We're happy to take a listen and see what we can do to again, try to make the best version of this show that we possibly can. Appreciate you listening first week, listening this week. Look forward to talking with you guys next week, and we will see you then. All right, guys, have a good one.